Let me begin with an acknowledgement of country. The school, and me personally, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the school's buildings are built. And we acknowledge traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Special welcome to all of us who have gathered this morning, and in particular if you've come with Indigenous heritage. It's wonderful to be able to welcome Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here to Melbourne Business School. Now, a quick overview of what you're about to receive, so to speak. Shortly I'll invite our guest speakers, Sean and Paul, introduce them in a moment, to come and join us up on the stage here. They'll participate in a conversation with us about the power of the Indigenous business sector. Like you, I'm sure you're looking forward to hearing what they have to tell us about that. We're streaming the event, as I've already mentioned, and about at 8:10 or so about 40 minutes in, we'll have a Q&A session. Then there'll be opportunities for you here in the room to put your questions to Sean and to Paul. And online, there's the Q&A box. So if you want to put a question in, mark your question in the Q&A as we do, and then we have a colleague here in the room who'll put your question to Sean or to Paul. We're all back into business again, so we're going to finish by 8:30, and you'll not have to go straight away, but we'll finish by then. That's our commitment. You can get on with your business day. Well, this morning's facilitated conversation is a joint event between Melbourne Business School and the Dylan Dewar Centre for Indigenous Business Leadership. Now, the Dylan Dewar is a joint initiative of Melbourne Business School and the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne, and it's one of the things of which we are really very proud. Of course, it's not the very first time that Melbourne Business School, or the faculty for that matter, have had an engagement with Indigenous matters. In our own case, that reaches back to 2012 with the first Murrah class here at Melbourne Business School, and it's really fitting that our speaker this morning, Sean, is an alumnus or graduate of that very first class in 2012, where there were only 12 students. It's grown a great deal since then, let me assure you. It's a wonderful initiative. So Sean and the 200 Murrah participants were directly responsible for the establishment of the Dylan Dewar Centre. It was their voices that spoke about the need for a centre to bring together research, teaching and engagement to showcase the Indigenous business sector. And as I mentioned to you, this centre is a true partnership between ourselves and the faculty, but more importantly, the community more broadly, the university, the business sector. We're a partnership with all of those different elements. Importantly, the centre is led by an Indigenous advisory group that informs the strategy and work of the centre. And over the coming months, you'll hear a whole lot more about what the centre's up to and its activities as it gears up. And we'd invite you to keep in touch with us to follow the journey of the Dylan Dewar. Let me now formally introduce our speakers this morning. Well, this morning we welcome, as you know, Sean Armistead, Executive Director, Government and Public Relations at IBA, the Indigenous Business Australia. Sean's traditional lands are located at Pathway in South Australia, and he's worked serving Indigenous communities around Australia for the past decade. Sean joined IBA in June of 2020. He's an experienced executive in corporate, community and not-for-profit sectors. He's managed and delivered nationally award-winning programs that are affecting communities throughout Australia in collaboration with federal and state governments, resulting in the employment of more than 900 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and tens of millions of dollars procured through Indigenous businesses. No doubt we'll hear more about all of that when Sean speaks to us this morning. Sean's a member of the Alumni Council of the University of Melbourne. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from the university and is an alumnus, as we pointed out, of the inaugural Murrah Indigenous Business Program. To join Sean in conversation this morning is my colleague, Professor Paul Jensen. Paul is Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics across the park at the university, a role that he's occupied since 2016. Up until 2021, Paul was the Program Director for the Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Commerce Honours and had responsibility for curriculum and program development, student support, academic staff matters in collaboration with other faculties. His role is now, in his new role, has strategic oversight of both the undergraduate and postgraduate programs offered in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Paul's main interests are innovation, science policy and technology markets. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the podium Sean Armistead and Paul Jensen.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners as well who are in the room today, but also to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So absolute honour to be on your country today, and a delight, an absolute delight, can I say, to be having this fireside chat with Sean Armistead about the power of Indigenous business. And let me just introduce Sean by saying that I can't think of a better person to represent the power of Indigenous business. He is a powerhouse himself. He is a trailblazer. And one of my colleagues in the room today mentioned that he thought that Sean was the most well-connected person he's ever met, which I think is testament to... that person could already have been identified in the room, but I think it's a wonderful exemplar of how you're respected and viewed in the Indigenous business landscape. And in many ways, Sean, I think you represent exactly what we'd love to bottle in Dylan Dua, a BCom alum from the University of Melbourne, Gen 1 Murrah alum. You're so well connected to us. You're a part of everything we do, and now with all of your business experience and your new role, or newish role, I was surprised to hear that was June 2020, by the way. It's almost 2 years. I feel like it's still a new role. But tell us a little bit more about how this all came about and how your experience at the University of Melbourne and Murrah has transformed your life.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Paul, and obviously starting by acknowledging the traditional owners and also Frank Zipfinger, who you said is a director. Frank's EMBA class was one of the ones who first financed or assisted in financing the very first Murrah class and was supportive of it. It was a bit of a legacy piece. So hello to Frank and thank you very much, and hopefully looking forward to catching up Tuesday week when he's in town. My journey, look, like a lot of people, up until the age of 28, I'd worked basically every single odd job you could imagine, factories, cleaning, all of those sorts of things. I'd been a barman, all of it. Never really had a career. And the penny dropped that education could be something valuable, and I was lucky enough to be able to enroll at Melbourne University. And throughout your life, you have these certain intersections and changes. You know, you meet certain people, you make certain decisions. You know, the old sliding doors. And I was fortunate enough to come to the university, meet a whole network of people, and then start a career, but at the same time come across the Murrah Indigenous Masterclass when it was being advertised. And I'm pretty sure it was just an email. Having been an alumni, it was an email that came through. And that was one of the, besides a men's Indigenous leadership program I did with DIWA, this was the next opportunity to work with somebody's doing construction outside, no worries. It was the first real opportunity to connect with Indigenous business people. And it was that first cohort, and I met Michelle and I met other people that I'd worked there with, and it was something that I loved and experienced and something that I've always supported. And that drove further the relationship with the university.
Right. So we love to think of Murrah as an activation space. And I'd love to hear more stories from you about how that actually worked. I mean, what is the secret sauce in Murrah that brings amazing people together and leads to great outcomes? I
think Murrah identifies, and it wasn't just an open door. Murrah identified, advertised and identified and accepted motivated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It pulled them together. It operated in a space with really key people to begin with, especially to get the momentum. So you had Professor Ian Williamson, and you had that, and then you bring people together, and it's an amazing. You know, we were talking about it, like the amount of businesses that have started because people have come together through Murrah. We said it the other day. Supply Oz is an example. Supply Oz is Adam Williams, Sean Andrews, Colleen Hicks, and Dion DeVal. They met here and they formulated a business. Sean and Adam, almost unstoppable. They are now over in LA attending Amazon, doing food. They've got their coffee brand, they've got PPE, they've excelled through the pandemic. And in fact, the pandemic has probably been the catalyst, and the market has been the catalyst for their success. Now, none of that comes together without them having been here at Murrah. And I met them together on the graduation dinner night, and they were already formulating ways they could work together. So you bring talented people into a room, you create an environment that's safe, an environment that challenges people, and then you foster and support them growing opportunities together. And you do that amongst a background where you have corporates, government, the policy that's there that creates the environment, a fertile land, in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can sow their businesses.
Very, very interesting. And you said something really powerful to me the other day when we were having a little catch up, and that was that we need to go beyond the transaction and move to the relationship. And I think there's gold dust in that. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that and what we can do, what we can do here, but also what the Indigenous, or what IBA and the Indigenous business community needs to do in order to push that forward, and to even tease out a little bit further about what the Australian corporate sector needs to do to move beyond the transaction.
Yeah, so I mean, there have always been Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owned businesses. There are businesses that aren't even registered with Supply Nation or Kinaway, etc. They're just Indigenous owned businesses. They're people getting on with the aspect of working and doing what they do. You know, you look in the Pilbara and there are many Aboriginal owned businesses up there that aren't members of peak bodies. They're just Aboriginal owned businesses doing their thing. I think in 2013 you had the Indigenous procurement policy come out by federal government. I think that's been the catalyst for so much change that we have seen. So, you know, we look at this sector, it's incredibly exciting. It's the last, 9 years, we've seen a ramp up. You have federal policy, then you have corporates. When we talk about more than just the transaction, for me what that is it's not just about who can we award contracts to, etc. You've got to look at a long-term relationship. You've got to have the ability to provide, if this is the way that you work, changing the way the corporate or the organisation works in order to do business, and not just in the near term, but over a longer period of time, is the relationship that I think most corporates and organisations and government departments should look for. In some aspects, for example, we'll have contracts and there might be a global contract, and yet we offer carve-out. And that's key, because there's not a lot of large Aboriginal-owned businesses, probably only one or two, by definition. Most Aboriginal businesses are small to medium enterprises. And yet if the bulk of contracts are large in size, by nature it excludes Indigenous businesses. So you have to create those carve-outs. And in creating that carve-out, the next part is also good terms. You've got to provide good terms, because we all know for small businesses especially, cash flow is king. Okay, there's not the access to finance or capital necessarily that other markets have. And so making sure you've got good terms, which again, all goes down to the relationship. It's not transactional. The organisation or the corporate wants to grow, wants to have a hand or a benefit or an advantage in growing that Indigenous business, so it becomes a relationship over time. I've got people from Sodexo here that I used to work for prior to IBA, and Sodexo's approach was certainly more than transactional. When there were issues, there were problems, it wasn't the Indigenous businesses' problems that they had to solve. It was how could Sodexo work with them together in order to create or get the right outcome. Sodexo again did the carve out. You have these massive contracts. How can we carve out something that fits the growth stage or the maturity stage of the Indigenous business? So it's having that approach that is more than just black or white. You've got to have great procurement people. I think from an IBA perspective, for us, we have what our pillars are. We have what our strengths are, whether it's the home loans, because people grow their wealth through homes. This is Australia. And having access and opening up the opportunity for people to own a home is key and critical. Your home becomes your base. It becomes where you build your wealth. From that becomes food security, housing stability. It does give you that base in which to then look, how do you start a small business if you don't even have housing security? So you have that. It gives you something to hand to your kids. We've got our business solutions or investments. Now that is very complex. And I always say business solutions, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses from an IBA perspective, that is the most complex piece because every business is different. Homes, you go through a pipeline. You understand, everybody understands. You get a deposit, you go here, you go through the process, you go look to the market, you try to buy a home. With business, it's different. Every Aboriginal-owned enterprise is different. It's at different stages, different concepts, it's different markets, different viability or feasibility, all of those aspects, and you've got different people steering it. You know, Leon's here. Leon, you know, is somebody who's had a world of experience. And so when you start to look to work with somebody like Leon, you go, okay, here's somebody who's tried and tested. So you can have a very different conversation with somebody like Leon with his civil contracting business, which I think is an amazing area.
Can I go back to that comment you made earlier about good procurement people? Because we ran a program a couple of years ago at the University of Melbourne with the Melbourne Business School and some big corporates, trying to bring Indigenous business and big corporates together. They hit a roadblock pretty similar to what you described, which is the chasm between the Indigenous business capability to take on $500,000 contracts. There was plenty of appetite amongst the procurement group to do that, but of course we just needed a bit of a stepping stone for the Indigenous business. And Professor Marcia Langton, when she was talking about the effectiveness of the program, had something really insightful to say about good procurement people, noting that really the issue was as much changing the culture in the procurement side of the equation as it was about building capability in Indigenous business. So what else do we need to do to get Australian corporate sector understanding of exactly those issues you're talking about the idiosyncrasies and nuances of Indigenous business so that they can work with business? So putting the onus on them to make sure they understand they need to change in order to work with Indigenous business.
Well, I think a lot of it becomes, it's the culture within the organisation, and how do you influence the culture? Well, there's two ways. It's obviously the internal influence, and you have people added in, or you have the organisation itself and the people go out into the world. I would say looking at coming to events like this, I would say working with the Dillandua Centre, engaging with the centre, engaging with people like Michelle Evans, engaging with Indigenous peak bodies like Kinaway and Supply Nation. But it's got to be more than just attending things. Look, when IBA has a partnership with the centre and going back to 2014 with the Murrah Indigenous Masterclass, so I think second or third gen of the class, that relationship with Murrah changes IBA because IBA has staff attending it, or employees attending it, but also IBA has exposure to it. IBA gets to hear the different stories of the people who are attending it. They get to meet people like Nicole Stewart and understand her journey within her dry cleaning business. They get to meet people like Jake, who's starting a trucking and logistics business and gets his first truck. I mean, a 25-year-old guy, and yes, he is my nephew, so I'll just give that. But as a 26-year-old buying a truck, I mean, I think that's amazing. He's taking much bigger risks than I would have at that age. So I think you've got to have the exposure to a centre like Dillandua. You've got to have the exposure to the people who run it and that knowledge. And that's how you change it. You can't change it sitting behind your desk. Organisations have to get out in amongst community. They have to get out in amongst Indigenous businesses. It's not one-way traffic with Indigenous businesses constantly coming to the corporates. The corporates have to go and be part of the Indigenous business sector. And to me, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have the Melbourne Business School involved in all of this, because of their convening power and the University of Melbourne's convening power to bring corporate Australia into the room to talk to Indigenous business, to understand from your perspective the cultural change that they need to make in order to work effectively with you. Yeah, and it's like the business school and the centre is almost like not the person not negotiating, but facilitating the interactions. I mean, how often do you hear, particularly people who at the start of their journey working as a corporate working within the Indigenous business sector, where they don't know anybody? That's one of the things that you see constantly. So the ability for a place or a centre, an institute, etc., to facilitate the interactions is key and critical.
Yeah, and again, that's, I think, one of the important roles we can play. But I'm curious to hear from you if there's anything more you think we should be doing in order to enhance that convening power. I mean, how do we go about doing this at scale so we can have 100 Sean Armisteds, you know?
You don't want that.
Maybe the world's not ready for that, Sean, but and success does come in lots of different flavours and shapes and sizes, but you know, your experience, your connectedness to us and to the Indigenous business community, I think is something we'd love to bottle and grow. And so how do we do that? Have we done enough to ensure that in 10 years' time, this is, you know, the Indigenous business sector is going to grow tenfold?
Well, you know, Ian said it before, you've had 200 people through that process. If you look at the people in that list of 200, there's some incredible businesses in it. We talked about Nicole, we talked about Adam Williams. Denny Francisco 2 weeks ago was invited to the Milan Fashion Festival or Fashion Week, Milan Fashion Week. So you're getting some amazing growth. I think what we have to do is also tell the stories. Because we tend to miss them. So if I say, oh, Denny Francisco presented it, you know, most people might not know who Denny Francisco is. They might not know that we had an Indigenous representation at the Milan Fashion Festival, probably the first time that's occurred. These are stories that people need to hear and be told. You know, Nicole Stewart, whose dry cleaning business has had to pivot because of the pandemic and those sorts of things. The boys the people at Supply Oz who really at the start of the pandemic and the crisis that was the pandemic were able to, I don't even want to use the word pivot, were able to adjust their business. I mean, Jasmine Harrow is another one. You know, she's a successful Torres Strait Islander businesswoman who has done an amazing job pre and during and will post-pandemic. It's telling those stories. You know, we've got Victorian state government here, you know, led by Hans and Mick Coombe, and doing the economic development there. I mean, it's the coming together of federal, state and local governments, institutions like the university, and the Indigenous businesses and corporates, and bringing them together. We have to be able to do that, and we have to be able to do it beyond a breakfast. So people like Nick can go away or meet somebody like Jake and whatever, if there's any opportunity for the business to take that conversation further. You know, we've got to be the agency, and then they have to own the actual outcomes.
You're a fantastic storyteller, so I'm glad that you're telling those stories of Murrah grads and the great outcomes they've achieved, because they are incredible, and we need to do more, I think, collectively to celebrate those. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your role at IBA. So, yes. Executive Director, tell us about how that works and what success looks like for you in that role.
Look, my role is a new function within the organisation. It's only been since June of 2020, so it's been primarily during the pandemic. It's a government and public relations function. There are 180 government agencies and departments at a federal level. There is a lot of noise to be held above it. Part of our job is to make sure that we can tell those stories, but build that awareness within government, not just with our own minister, but other departments and agencies about what IBA does, and more importantly, who our clients are and what they're doing, customers are and what they're doing. So my role, you know, the success there, look, ultimately, and this was, you know, we'll front inquiries, we'll front Senate estimates to answer questions and the scrutiny that goes with it. But you know, we would love nothing more than, you know, if I'm probably measured ultimately by success, I'd love to see legislative change that sits on top of what we do as an organisation, what we are as an agency. And with that legislative change allows us to rapidly expand the amount that we can support the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities with. Because right now, you know, if we look at our housing, and you know, housing is pretty much our backbone. You know, it's the largest part of what we do. You know, over our journey, we've had 20,000. We've delivered more than 20,000 home loans. But you know, we are very much limited. We have probably a 20% appropriation through government. The other 80% is driven by our own principle and interest to reinvest back into the housing market. So, you know, we have our housing market. So if we can get legislative change That would be ultimately what I would say I'm measured by, but also building that awareness of what we do as an organisation. That's probably it in a nutshell.
Yeah, fantastic. Very, very interesting. I wonder if we can move along to kind of discuss this space and this institution again, and just reflect back on your experience as a 20-something Indigenous man coming to study at the University of Melbourne in the BCom.
Yeah. Look,
tell us about that, and also just reflect on whether you think we've done enough to make sure this is a safe and welcoming and nurturing place for Indigenous people.
Sure. Look, I'm the first person from my family having gone to university. At 28, when I went as a mature age student, one of the things that I quickly learnt was nobody tells you anything at the university, and if you ask a question, you'll get half an answer. And I'm not talking about the staff. I'm talking about, you're trying to find, as a 28-year-old, 10 years out of even being in high school, everything's foreign. Everything's foreign. For me, what was critical to my success in being able to stay at the university was the Murrah Barrack, which was at the time called the Centre for Indigenous Education, CIE. That gave me a sense of community, that gave me that sort of security, that gave me a community of people facing the same or similar challenges. That was critical. My view of university was, look, I'm not an academic person. It's incredibly hard for me to get through. Everything was a struggle academically, but I got there. I found the environment to be fantastic. I think that the university has certainly changed. The university listened to people like Marcia Lankin, to Michelle Evans, and has adapted and understood that it was as an older institution, and with that older institution become institutional behaviours and values that may need to change with the times. So I saw that. Obviously, the university's investment into these programs, I just think are brilliant. When I finally got through, my philosophy at university was always, you always say yes. So I was the first Indigenous office bearer for the student union, so I took that on. There was an opportunity, I even look at my career and showing up. I don't have this career unless I showed up, unless I attended a lunchtime presentation by Electronic Data Systems, which later was bought by Hewlett-Packard. And it was the head of HR and the business operations manager, and it was myself and another mate of mine. Okay, and the mate of mine talked about suing his last employer, so that just left me. And so I then take the job with Hewlett-Packard. My boss leaves. There's the GFC that's happening. There's downsizing. I get his role. I jump from there to KPMG. All of that stems because I attended an Indigenous a presentation at the Centre for Indigenous Education here at Melbourne Uni. There's constantly those changes that you get, and I've said to Jake before, is that my philosophy is always say yes, and if you think you've bitten off too much, chew more. Just chew faster, just get through it. And there's fantastic opportunities there. I mean, we live in a time where never have we had so many people wanting us to succeed as a community of people. There are still the people out there who want us to fail, absolutely. There's still some of the institutional barriers there that are designed to catch us, you bet. But we have never lived in a time where we've had more emphasis by government, by the corporate sector, wanting us to succeed, and to me that's just exciting. And it's not rivers of gold, we know that. It's not rivers of gold. But there is a wonderful opportunity while the window's open to get successful Indigenous businesses to stand up, to succeed, to hopefully scale. One truck this month, the next truck in 2 months, the next truck after that, 3 months after that, which is happening. To have that scaling, I think is wonderful. And then these people become the beacons within our community. Because when I was growing up, I don't think I knew any Indigenous business owners. Now most of my network is Aboriginal business owners. So, the times change.
Absolutely. And my risk-averse nature is saying, Jake, don't grow too quickly. One truck every month is going to be too much.
Yeah,
but you're the
same thing, all right?
Oh, okay, right.
But he's got it.
I thought you were saying chew faster if you need to. But very, very interesting. And I want to just go back to something you mentioned there. While the window is open, do you think the window is only open temporarily, or is this a permanent change?
Having seen the window open, I just have that innate worry that the window will also close. And what it might be is the emphasis. The emphasis could change and probably will change. What we have to do is effect enough cultural change so that it's not reliant on policy. Because what we need is a point in time which all these Aboriginal-owned and Torres Strait Islander-owned businesses stand up regardless of government policy. So if the IPP is taken away, and corporates and tier one corporates and major projects don't, that organisation's business still say, we want to use Leon's business or we want to use Jake's business. So that's how we'll know there'll be success, and we have to get it to that stage. I think the policy is brilliant. I think it's been one of the greatest impacts to one of the best forms of Indigenous policy impacting Indigenous people. And then I come back to the centre, because I want to tie it back in, which is you have a centre that does research. Research informs policy, policy informs outcomes. And so that's the important part of tying it together. Nobody's operating in isolation. In this room, you can see all the different stakeholders and how it ties back in. And you go back to the point, where do you facilitate it from? You facilitate it from a centre or an institute that does these things, that has the history, the strength that comes with the brand that is Melbourne University, the Melbourne Business School.
And many institutes, I think, let's be honest. I mean, we are just one of many organisations that needs to be doing this, needs to be making that cultural change, or at least supporting corporates and Indigenous business in order to make this. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said eventually success means we don't need the IPPP.
Yep.
Once we've got there, which may take 10, 20 years, we don't know, but I'd like to think that window is permanently open. I think we are seeing something that's a permanent change, but we need to keep pushing hard on that, and we need to keep delivering success.
Yeah, it might be the pessimist in me. You look at the US, this policy in the US is from the Nixon administration, right? It's a Nixon administration policy for the affirmative action with black businesses. You go to the US, there are organisations, the city of Fort Worth has 40% spend with minority businesses, 40%. It can stick around, absolutely. But it just goes to show not how far behind, that Australia's ready now. The US, with all of its problems, this was back in the late 60s, early 70s.
All right, that's a wonderful point to draw this conversation to a conclusion, or at least our conversation to a conclusion. But there's a discourse with you in the room and online that we'd like to open up. We do have roving mics, and Danielle is there in the background handing over the microphone, actually. So someone will be there to make sure that if you wanted to ask a question of a very interesting and inspirational story and commentary from Sean, please put your hand up now and I'll make sure. Jake, first question.
It's not a Dorothy Dix, all right?
Hi, thank you for that. You kind of touched on an interesting point, which was access to capital being a major barrier for Aboriginal business. What role do you think the banks have to play, and are they doing enough to support Aboriginal business? Obviously, IBA is an important, cornerstone of Aboriginal business, and there are other institutions which are making headway. But are banks doing enough, or what more could they look at doing?
Okay. And I should say, I don't see Jake all the time. I see him occasionally. In fact, even at IBA, something comes up and I say, I don't know what Jake's doing. Look, good question, mate. Look, we can all be doing more. I think it's hard. Like, I don't want to say something too negative. I think that, I certainly think the big banks could do more. If the big banks were doing more, and then you wouldn't have First Australians capital, You wouldn't have the need for IBA because they'd be delivering it across everything. We had the Banking Royal Commission that probably impacted it a bit because people start talking, they fall into a default position of responsible lending or responsible banking, responsible financing. Too often that's a pathway to no. Again, the majority of Indigenous businesses are early in their maturity and life cycle, right? So it means you have to take more risk. Business is risk. Banks are risk adverse. So we look at IBA. We have startup packages. Unsecured. That's the first offer, an unsecured. So it could be a percentage of grant, percentage of loan, and it's unsecured. That's a hell of a risk. It's not carte blanche open to everybody, but it is there. But it's also limited in size because you're trying to deliver it to as many as you can. Could the banks do more? Yeah, the banks could do more. And I will say this: they've got some fantastic people in there. They've got some fantastic people leading the areas, but they are big beasts. I mean, we talk about Melbourne University as an institution. These banking institutions, Westpac was the first bank listed on the ASX, right? The oldest ASX listed company. There's 100+ years of a beast that has grown and has created its own culture. It's not changing overnight.
Other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Hi guys, Yamariki Egan, young Indigenous business owner working under corporate property and finance and a current student as well. Just wondering if you have any advice for a young Indigenous professional coming into the industry. What I've found so far is because of the underrepresentation of Indigenous people, often we find we have a lot of responsibilities in the sector, meaning that often Indigenous professionals don't have just one job title. So if there's, say I work in the building industry, so if there's an Indigenous engineer or architect, he often sits on a reconciliation action board or sits in another sector as well. And I'm just finding that, there's a lot of cultural load and, I see myself mirroring a lot of your attitude as well, just continuously staying hungry and saying yes to a lot of things as well. Just seeing if you have any advice as to sort of taking on that responsibility and managing that workload.
Yeah, obviously you're going to work long hours. I sort of think about my 30s, even 30, let's call it 35 to 45. 35 to 45, Look, I think a couple of things. One, it's a shame that you become the source of truth for everything Indigenous within an organisation. That's where it is at the moment. The only way to change that is somewhat higher, as you grow your Indigenous employee base. You're not the single source that they go to every time. It's also, I think, pushing back and educating or managing the organisation with that. It's difficult at times. It also provides an opportunity because it does give you exposure. It gives you exposure probably more so than other people in your positions if they weren't Indigenous. So you do get that exposure. So it is a benefit. I think that there's more upside to downside to where you are in your position. It just means that the bandwidth that you have to commit is huge. And then you've also got to work out, what do you want to do? Do you really want to be, this professional in this line, or do you want to start your own business? And do you do a joint venture, a partnership, all those sorts of things? What is your responsibility for mentoring, leading the way, supporting other businesses, other Indigenous employees, internal and external to your organisation? My advice is keep doing what you're doing. Like, obviously, but you've got, at some point you hit a point where you start to say no, and you'll know, and you'll be like, I'm not going to do that. Because I used to say yes, and get it done, because that was the key thing. If you're going to say yes, deliver. But then there's a point where you say no. And it's almost a tipping point. And once you get to that point, then you're really choosing the pieces that you want to commit your time to. But it's a lonely place sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting to hear from you, Sean, what the role of mentoring here. I mean, what sort of support can there be from Indigenous business leaders like yourself? As we said, you are a powerhouse, that you're an inspiration to a lot of people, and I think there'd be many people who'd like to hear from you and have a mentoring relationship with you, and not just you, but what role does that play in supporting young Indigenous business people?
So my view on mentoring is I think you have a range of mentors. And one of the great things about mentors is that immediately their network becomes your network. And I had an opportunity, again, with the reason I know Frank is because Murrah paired myself and Jasmine Harrow with Frank as our mentor. And then Jasmine and I started a business together. So we had a coffee business that we had. So I've been grateful for the mentorship from people like Frank. There's another gentleman called Ray Andrews who pulled together the 4 or 5 people that he mentors, and we have a breakfast we used to be every second month. Now we've done some online ones, of course, during the pandemic, Friday night drinks. I think that it's important to get the mentors for your own self, and then also the mentors like Leon, being able to mentor other people coming through. And I don't know, Leon, my view of the world is if you can mentor somebody and they end up becoming your competition, fantastic. That's success, right? Because competition is good. And so we certainly have a role. I think by the community and culture, there's the mentoring that goes with it. It's I don't even think it's a choice, right? It's if any Aboriginal person younger was to come to me for advice, I'm not making myself available. And if they wanted to come consistently and create that sort of mentoring aspect, 100%, the reality is I have to make time.
Yep. No, absolutely.
You have to make it work.
And I wonder, do those relationships, because they're part of your DNA, because they're part of your culture, do they happen just organically, or is there anything else we need to activate and support them?
I think they happen organically, but there's a great opportunity. Again, I go back to Murrah, 200 people that have gone through it. Now, there are people at different stages of their careers and different success, but the ability for those people who have gone through the program to be able to mentor other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people coming through, and non-Indigenous people, right? Because we want to build awareness. We want to, provide that cultural understanding and capability. So I don't think the dynamic of mentoring is always like that. I think there's a great opportunity for Indigenous people to mentor their CEOs, mentor. You see, you can't help but look at people. An example, Shelley Cable. So the impact or influence Shelley Cable has at a young age, and she probably, I assume, gets sick and tired of saying, "Oh, she's so young," right? Is that she has an incredible level of influence, particularly upwards. And she's mentored, she's got some great mentors, but she also has that ability to influence up.
Yeah, very powerful. A couple of questions over here, and then Danielle, I might just check in with you about questions online. Yes, so Steve, there are some questions. We'll go after these two.
Oh, hello, Liz Gillies, CEO of the Menzies Foundation. We build leadership movements for the greater good. We have a program in the Kimberley with 100 women from across the Kimberley in a business club, the Mugdana Makers. The clearest and to build leadership for the greater good, we build incubators for multi-sector collaborations to address leadership challenges. The clearest articulation I've heard anywhere in the world about leadership for the greater good was sitting around a campfire in the Kimberley with the 40 women at the camp who talked about their desire to build a circular economy where they put themselves, their family, their community and the land at the centre of everything. And I'm just wondering if you could, we've heard a lot about how important it is that companies learn more about your culture, but I do think there's an awful lot. All of us sitting in this room could learn from you about that view of the world and what the greater good means for Indigenous community.
Yeah. Greater good for the Indigenous community. I don't want to start from a sort of, a deficit sort of mindset, but I love the fact that there is an opportunity. You don't want to use terms like close the gap, etc., because they've become very federalised. but changing the landscape and changing the opportunities and opening the ability for young people in particular and women in particular to come through, to be able to create a sense of almost economic independence and autonomy and to become a positive part of the economy is for me very, very, very important. I think that when you talk about some of the best things that you've heard have been around the campfire, you do get that. It's the simple stuff for me. It is this simple. We anybody who's been involved in consulting knows that it becomes all these terms, etc. And you just go, let's just get back to the basics on this. Do we want to make this world a better place or not? How do we do it in a way that's not, that's having the less negative impact and more positive impact? And does this centre do this? Yes. Does empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be successful in business and therefore be impactful into their families and into the communities, and Uncle Jake in the future becomes somebody that the other people in the family and nephews and nieces look towards. I mean, that's the incredible part for me about do we want a greater good? And you can get that. I mean, we have a program called Strong Women, Strong Business. And that has been one of the flagships of what IBA does. Pandemic put it on ice a little bit because there's nothing better than being around a campfire rather than being around a Zoom virtual campfire. It's not the same thing. It's just not. But it is certainly been one of the key programs that we've ran, and it has changed people's lives, and it creates those relationships. So, I mean, in short, look, that's how I see us creating a positive impact.
And then there was a question behind. Sorry.
Hello, Lan.
One at the back.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for the presentation. A little bit of disclosure here. I'm part of the Dylan Dewar Centre, and I've known Sean since 2013, so it's been an absolute joy. Sean, you'll know that some of your Murrah alumni refer to Melbourne Business School as actually the Murrah Business School. That's how intertwined they are to this institution and to the University of Melbourne. But there's a large number of Indigenous businesses in regional and remote communities. So what can we do as an institution to connect, to support, to engage?
Yeah, well, okay, we're hopefully going into a post-pandemic world, okay, and and during the pandemic, we, with our partnership, we had those what we call the interactive hubs, etc. Getting back to, like the Menzies Foundation said, which is face-to-face, and I think that's critical for Murrah to be able to do those face-to-face pieces where you can actually share and bring the knowledge that's here out there, and and I'm sure that's what we're going to be doing in the next 12 to 24 months, or hopefully the next 12 months, hopefully this year, as we do. So that's the critical part. It's getting back out there, because it has been an incredibly isolating time. Regional and remote people feel isolated anyway, right? They often feel second, forgotten, an afterthought. And then you put on top of that a pandemic where nobody's even going out. We talk about the issues around going to remote communities, etc., and just the dangers around it. And currently I approve travel within IBA, so it's carefully looking at who's going where and what are their statuses and what precautions are being taken. Hopefully we're now moving beyond that, and we're going to be able to see organisations like Murrah, Melbourne Business School, Dylan Dewar, IBA, getting back out amongst regional Australia and those remote communities.
Hi, Sean, my name's Lucy Duncan. I'm the Director for Culture and Capability Development for Supply Chain at Johnson & Johnson in Asia Pacific. I absolutely loved your practical example of challenges within the procurement function, because I thought that really illustrated the kind of thing that we can experience day to day. I just would be grateful if you could articulate another one or two practical examples like that of where we see stumbling blocks in corporates, just for our awareness.
Okay. I mean, an example, and I'll talk to my former colleagues. I think one of the key policies that changed was we created a suppliers book of Indigenous businesses that we're qualified in. So first off, there's the policy of narrowing the scope of suppliers. One narrow scope, except for Indigenous. Bring them in, we want to meet them, we want to be able to do work with Indigenous businesses. We also created an Indigenous suppliers book of qualified businesses. We resourced it with somebody who was committed to working and managing those relationships. And then because, and I feel weird that you're here and I'm talking about your business that you lead, Daniel. But one of the things that we did, I'll say 2 years ago when I was there, was that also with some of the, this is a business that has 250 plus sites, and some of those sites you have site managers, and when something goes wrong, they pick up the phone, and normally what they'll do is they'll pick up the phone to a supplier they know. Well, as a focus, at least try the Indigenous business first. See if they have the capacity and the capability to do the job and they're competitive on their pricing. If they are, go with them. And I think particularly that concept of we're reducing the number of suppliers except if Indigenous businesses, where we want to meet you and we want to understand your business and where there's an opportunity to be able to work with you was key. I think that was key. The policy and the resourcing. If you can do those two things, and then finding the areas within your business, because often you come to corporates and they go, yeah, well, we're not sure, what areas, and you go, well, let's look at what you're buying. What are you procuring? Okay, what are the areas of which, and then start to identify Indigenous businesses within those spaces where you can carve out or you can work with those businesses in your supply chain. It's a lot of people don't get supply chain and procurement is a science. Like a lot of businesses live or die on making sure their procurement is on point, and so there's a whole. And then if you're in supply chain as you are, you've got downwards pressure saying, find more savings, reduce your suppliers, all of that. You've then got a RAP committee, or you've got organisational commitments to make sure you get this spent. So you're getting pulled in a million different ways. So I think it's have the policy in place, resource the policy, and then build that network of Indigenous businesses. And even that one thing, call an Aboriginal business first. That's what you have. You don't have to go with them, but call them first. That was very similar to I think it's called the Rooney Rule in the US, in the NFL. The NFL was primarily black players, all white coaches, and they said, how do we get a black coach? And one of the owners of the team said, well, we'll institute a rule where you don't have to hire a black coach, but you have to interview her. You at least have to have an interview. And lo and behold, over time, they found black coaches, and now there are more black coaches involved. And I think it's called the Rooney Rule. Make the phone call, because if you're not making the phone calls, you're never going to engage Indigenous businesses. If you're at least making the phone call, you have an opportunity to engage an Indigenous business.
It's a great question, Lucy, and fantastic advice, Sean. Thank you so much. There was one question here, and I'm also very conscious of the fact that Professor Harper gave a guarantee that we'd be finished right on 8:30, and I know he's a man who sticks to his commitments. So let's have two questions. One, and there was someone here possibly, or one at the back. Daniel.
Daniel Wilton, Supply Chain Director at Sodexo. In terms of maturation, right, how mature is this? Because I look at the business that we do, and there's certain categories that and all I would be doing is taking work from this supplier and giving it to another supplier and not really progressing. I mean, from an Indigenous standpoint. There's other categories that are less mature that we go, okay, let's go after that and see what we can do to expand that further. But from the overall scheme of things, I look at the strategy and go, okay, how far can we get this? Because there is a finite capacity. The question is, how far are we in this journey to go? This is embedded. There's not an overt requirement here to set these targets. It's just a norm. Expansive question, I understand that, but I look at it from my own perspective and I can probably figure that out. We've got about this much further to go, and I think we've topped out based on supply availability, finite capacity, blah, blah, blah. How far are we in, and how far do you reckon there is to go on the journey?
Okay, so if we're looking at from the maturity of the business sector, or are we looking at from the maturity of the supply chain?
Probably, honestly, a bit of both, Sean, frankly.
From the maturity of the supply chain, I think it depends on the organisation. The true test of it is this. You walk out of here and you don't go back to Sodexo. What happens? And let's say it's yourself and Jackie, just don't go back to Sodexo today. That's it, done. what happens to the Indigenous businesses and the ability for the organisation to continue that? Is it part of the process? Is it part of the culture? I think you've built a team culture that it is there, but that's not everywhere. How often do you see a program that's run by one or two people within an organisation or corporate, for example, become lesser when the one or two key people leave? I've seen it, and so one, it depends on the organisation, it depends on the culture within the organisations and processes you have in place, and the capacity. There are only so many businesses in the Pilbara, right? And everybody in the Pilbara is competing for those businesses. So unless you're going to increase the size and scale of those businesses, you will hit a finite limit. But then it's the rest of Australia. We're talking about the whole market. So I think it depends on the organisations, it depends on the geography of where you're operating, and it depends on the businesses operating in that sector. I think if you're looking at New South Wales, you're looking at Victoria, etc., and Queensland, some of the country, there's massive opportunities. And I think so many businesses or corporates, and government departments especially, have a long way to go. I think there's been some really good successes, but there still is a long way to go, and I think it's really individualised.
That was a very tough question to ask quickly, Sean, but well done. We do have time for one final question. Danielle?
Yes, thank you. We've got Katrina online who's asking a pretty fitting question to wrap up today. She's wondering, what's your call to action for us that we can implement when we leave today to empower Indigenous business and business people?
Yeah. Two parts. One, I think it swings back into being involved and engaged in not just Dillandua, but programs like this. I think that's a key part. You have to continue to be engaged. I think that there is an opportunity for organisations to work with, Supply Nation, the Indigenous Chambers of Commerce in their regions and states. Here it's Kinaway. But I also think it is about maybe you change the way maybe you even change or challenge the way you're thinking and operating and working with Indigenous businesses within your own organisation. I think that's key. If you happen to be ISS, how do you work with more Indigenous businesses? Where does it come from? Are there ways in which to work with Leon's organisation, Jake's organisation, etc.? What are the ways at which you can work differently? And how can you build deeper relationships? I think if you engage with centres like Dillandua and support them, if you work with Indigenous businesses for a relationship and not a transaction, and you look at the medium and long term, I think that's where we'll get our success.
What a great way to wrap up. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sean. That was an absolute pleasure, as expected.
It went quickly for me. I'm not sure about everybody else.
And I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Thanks very much, Paul. Sean, I'm aware there are many people here who know you well.
Oh, yeah.
We've only met this morning ourselves, but suffice to say, I now understand why they regard you as a powerhouse.
Yes.
It's just terrific to hear you speak, and what resonates with me. The piece of advice to aspiring young Indigenous business people: yes, yes, yes. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Eventually, no, but in the short term, yes, yes, yes.
100%.
And then advice to those involved in procuring things from Indigenous businesses: call Indigenous business first. Not necessarily have to go with them, but call them first. I think it's just terrific advice. So, Sean, thank you for being so open and honest and so full of power and energy this morning. I hope you'll accept this small gift from us in acknowledgement of your service to us this morning.
Thanks,
Thank you very much indeed. All of my colleagues, thank you for drawing out the best of Sean and helping him to share his wisdom with us this morning. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out. Thanks for being with us in person. We've started our in-person events again at the school, so this isn't the last by any means. Keep an eye on the website. Also keep an eye on what's happening with Dillandua. Lots more in store there as well. And this morning has been a joint function with Dillandua, so we're delighted once again to be able to acknowledge that fact. Thank you for joining us online, and thank you, Frank, for your involvement, particularly with Sean and the early pieces he acknowledged. It's terrific to have you involved with the school, but also obviously with Dillandua through your philanthropy with your fellow former EMBAs. So with that, let me thank everyone again for joining us this morning. I wish you a very successful and pleasant day.
Thanks.
That was really good.
Morning.